Have you ever wondered how seemingly strong companies actually fail? Not those that fall in a scandalous way, with headlines, public crises, or sudden collapses, but those that disappear in silence. What if the real danger in business was not in risky decisions nor in obvious mistakes, but precisely in silent decisions, those that seem harmless, rational, and even intelligent at the time they are made? Most people imagine failure as something noisy, a serious mistake, an unexpected crisis, an external event impossible to predict. But the reality is much more uncomfortable. Most of the time, failure does not arrive announcing its presence. It settles in little by little, disguised as normality. The meetings continue to happen. The reports still seem acceptable. The results are not alarming. On the outside, everything works. And this is exactly what makes the process so dangerous. Companies that end up collapsing are rarely led by incompetent people. On the contrary, many of them are led by experienced, intelligent, confident, and respected leaders. The problem is not a lack of technical capacity. It's a psychological problem. It's the way success changes human behavior, how past victories create certainty, how certainty reduces curiosity, and how, little by little, curiosity ceases to exist, taking with it the ability to question, listen, and adapt. It is at this point that silent decisions begin to shape the future. This is not a single big mistake, but a sequence of small choices. Postpone a difficult conversation, minimize a warning sign, ignoring uncomfortable feedback, trust your own assumptions more than external data. Every decision seems justifiable. Each can be explained rationally. And precisely because they do not cause an immediate impact, they do not arouse urgency. On the contrary, they create a dangerous feeling of control. Over time, these choices start to accumulate. Customer complaints are now treated as exceptions. Market changes are seen as temporary. Internal warnings are labeled as pessimism. Uncomfortable information is filtered through optimistic narratives. Little by little, the organization becomes less sensitive to reality, not because people are bad or negligent, but because the entire system learns to avoid discomfort. Comfort becomes a priority. Stability becomes the main objective, and the ability to adapt begins to disappear. The most unsettling aspect of this process is that it looks professional. It looks mature. It looks controlled. There is no chaos. There is no panic. There are no obvious signs of failure, just the continuity of routines, strategies, and decisions, as if everything were under control. When problems finally become visible, the cost to correct them is much higher. Options are more limited. Important people have already left. Trust has already been shaken. And the collapse, when it happens, seems sudden, even though it was built slowly over years. The truth is uncomfortable. Companies are rarely destroyed by a single bad decision. They are destroyed by repeated moments of delay, denial, and overconfidence. By leaders who choose what is comfortable over what is necessary. For organizations that confuse silence with stability, and stability with strength. These are not spectacular failures. These are human failures, psychological. And exactly for this reason, they continue to be repeated in different sectors, cultures, and times. And if you think this standard only applies to large corporations, you may be underestimating the reach of these silent decisions. The same mechanism appears in teams, startups, careers, and leadership at all levels. The same belief that there is still time. The same habit of avoiding difficult decisions. It is precisely from this point that we need to move forward, understanding how these decisions begin to form, and why, once started, they become so difficult to stop. And before we go even deeper into this topic, there is something important that needs to be said. This type of discussion is not common, because it requires reflection. It demands honesty. It requires each person to look at decisions they may prefer not to revisit. Therefore, if at any point in this video something made sense to you, if any phrase aroused discomfort, identification, or memory, I would like to know. Leave a comment. It doesn't need to be elaborate. Sometimes a single sentence reveals much more than it seems. Reviews are not just numbers. They show that this subject is not abstract, that it is alive in the experience of those who watch. Many of the silent decisions that destroy companies also appear in the professional lives of ordinary people, in small teams, in personal projects, in careers that are shaped by postponed choices. Sharing this helps to broaden the conversation and bring new perspectives to those who are also watching. If this content makes sense to you, Leaving a like is a simple way of indicating that this type of analysis deserves to continue existing. This is not just support for the channel, but for the topic itself. The more people interact, the more this type of reflection reaches those who may not have stopped to think about it yet. And if you're not already signed up, consider signing up. The next videos follow exactly this line, understanding why important failures are rarely obvious, and how human behavior influences critical decisions behind the scenes in organizations. Now from here, we need to look more closely at where everything really starts to distort, not at the moment of the collapse, but long before it. At the point where leaders start to interpret clear signals as noise, the moment the habit of putting off difficult decisions starts to seem like a strategy rather than a problem. This is exactly where silent decisions stop being exceptions and start to become a pattern. In the next part, we'll delve into this territory in more depth, how these patterns form within companies, why they repeat themselves even among experienced people, and what causes obvious signs to be ignored without anyone realizing that something is wrong. Companies rarely give clear signals that they are about to fail. Most of the time, what exists is a prolonged period of normality. Everything seems to follow its usual course. The same meetings take place on the same days. Decisions are made in the same way. The reports keep coming. Indicators do not trigger immediate alarms. It is precisely this stable routine that creates the most dangerous feeling of all, that there is no reason to worry. When everything seems normal, no one feels the need to look more closely. This is the silence before the fall. Not absolute silence, but psychological silence. A state in which nothing attracts enough attention to cause real discomfort. The company works. People fulfill their roles. The environment does not seem hostile. And for this very reason, vigilance decreases. Curiosity weakens. Questioning starts to seem like exaggeration. After all, if everything is working, why change? If there is no crisis, why create tension? False stability is built exactly there, not because the problems don't exist, but because they haven't yet manifested themselves clearly. Small deviations are tolerated. Small inefficiencies are normalized. Small postponed decisions accumulate without being perceived as a pattern. The organization enters an automatic mode, where repetition of the routine becomes confused with security. And the longer this state lasts, the more difficult it becomes to break away from it. Human behavior plays a central role in this process. The brain seeks predictability. He feels comfortable when the days look alike, when decisions follow known models, when the risk seems distant. This psychological comfort creates an invisible trap. The more normal everything seems, the less willingness there is to question what is behind this normality. The absence of chaos is now interpreted as proof that the decisions are correct. At this point, leaders and teams begin to rely excessively on superficial signals. As long as there is no abrupt drop, everything seems under control. As long as revenue doesn't plummet, there's no urgency. Until customers abandon in droves, warnings are seen as overkill. This logic creates a dangerous relationship with time. Time starts to be seen as an ally, when in fact it is being wasted. Each month without a crisis reinforces the idea that there is still margin, there is still space, there is still control. The problem is that this feeling of control is rarely real. It is built on continuity, not adaptation. The company continues to do what it has always done, the way it has always done it, believing that this is a sign of strength. But strength is not repetition. Strength is the ability to perceive subtle changes before they become irreversible. When this capability is lost, the organization may appear stable on the outside, while becoming fragile on the inside. It is in this environment that silent decisions gain space. Not obviously wrong decisions, but decisions not to act, to wait another cycle, to observe another quarter, not to confront uncomfortable data, of not questioning a strategy that still seems to work. Each of these choices reinforces artificial normality, and the more normal everything seems, the harder it becomes to accept that something needs to change. This silence does not generate immediate tension. It generates accommodation. Accommodation creates distance between internal perception and external reality. The company starts to respond more to its own habits than to market signals. And when that distance grows, decisions leave from being guided by adaptation to being guided by preservation. Preserve the routine. Preserve the feeling of stability. Preserve the idea that control still exists. The most dangerous thing is that at this stage, any attempt to break the silence can be seen as a threat. Questioning becomes interpreted as negativity. Warning starts to sound like pessimism. Normality becomes a value to be protected, and protecting normality, in an environment that has already begun to change, is a silent way of accelerating the collapse. Not because anyone wants to destroy the company, but because no one wants to be the first to admit that the scenario is no longer the same. This is exactly where the cycle temporarily closes and prepares to move forward. Because when silence sets in, it does not remain neutral. It begins to shape future decisions, influence behavior, and reduce the margin for reaction. And it is from this point that the problem stops being just the feeling of stability and starts to transform into something deeper, more structural, and more difficult to reverse. Before we go any further, I want to know if this scenario sounds familiar to you. In the comments, write, "Everything seemed normal," or "The silence was deceiving." If you prefer something more direct, just comment, "I've seen this happen," or "Dangerous normality." These comments help you understand how much more common this pattern is than you might think, and set the stage for the next point. Once normalcy sets in and silence becomes comfortable, success begins to play a decisive role in how decisions are made. Not immediate success, but one that accumulates over time, creating an internal narrative of competence, success, and mastery of the situation. Positive results not only strengthen confidence, they shape the perception of reality. Little by little, what was once just experience turns into certainty, and certainty reduces the willingness to question. This is a delicate point, because success is rarely seen as a threat. On the contrary, it is celebrated as proof that the path adopted is correct. Strategies that worked in the past are now treated as permanent truths. Decisions that worked once gain model status. And in this process, curiosity, one of the main drivers of adaptation, begins to disappear. When everything seems to be working, asking too much starts to seem unnecessary. Behavioral change does not happen abruptly. It infiltrates the small attitudes of everyday life. Meetings become more predictable. The same voices dominate the discussions. Ideas that challenge consensus are met with less enthusiasm, not because they are wrong, but because they create discomfort. Success creates a zone of psychological safety, and anything that threatens that zone tends to be rejected, even if it brings valuable information. Over time, leaders start to trust their intuition more than external signals. Experience becomes a filter. Data that confirms beliefs is valued, while data that contradicts expectations is questioned. Market feedback is reinterpreted. Criticisms are relativized. The problem is not confidence itself, but too much of it. When confidence stops coexisting with doubt, it turns into rigidity. This rigidity directly affects the way risks are assessed. Instead of seeing emerging risks, the organization starts to see only known risks. Anything that deviates from the norm is seen as unlikely or temporary. Past success creates the illusion of predictability in an environment that by nature is unstable. And the longer this illusion persists, the more difficult it becomes to accept that the context has changed. Another silent effect of prolonged success is a decrease in active listening. When leaders believe they have been through similar situations, they tend to listen less and conclude faster. Important conversations are cut short. Alerts are treated as retries. The feeling of having seen everything before generates a specific type of blindness. The inability to realize that the current scenario is not the same as the previous one, even if it seems familiar. This behavior creates an environment where decisions continue to be made with conviction, but are increasingly less aligned with external reality. The company doesn't stop. It doesn't go into an immediate crisis. It doesn't lose everything at once. It just starts to respond more slowly to changes. And this slowness, added to overconfidence, creates a structural delay. When the organization finally realizes that something is wrong, others have already moved forward. The most worrying thing is that at this stage, success is still used as a defense argument. Past results are cited as proof that the strategy remains valid. Historical metrics are used to justify current decisions. The internal narrative strengthens. It has always worked. We have faced worse things. We know what we are doing. This narrative is powerful because it reduces fear and increases the feeling of control, but it also reduces the sensitivity to perceive subtle changes. This is how success, which should be a resource, turns into a trap. It creates comfort. Comfort reduces questioning, and the lack of questioning makes room for silent decisions that shape the future without being noticed. The problem is not winning. It's continuing to act as if winning in the past guaranteed adaptation in the present. This is the moment when behavior changes, even if the results don't yet reflect it. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. In the comments, write excessive confidence, comfort zone, or blind success. If you prefer something simpler, comment, I've seen that, or that makes sense. These answers help you understand how this pattern appears in practice and set the stage for the next point. After success has already changed internal behavior and excessive confidence begins to consolidate, decisions are no longer analyzed as isolated events and begin to form an almost invisible pattern. There is no clear moment when someone says we are going to make a mistake, but there is a sequence of small choices that, together, create a profound effect. These are seemingly minor decisions, taken on a daily basis, that shape the future of the organization without attracting attention. Each of them alone seems irrelevant. Together, they become decisive. These decisions are rarely seen as mistakes. On the contrary, they are usually justified as prudence, caution, or strategy. Postponing a change seems sensible. Postponing a fix seems responsible. Avoiding internal confrontation seems to preserve the organizational climate. The problem is that, over time, these choices begin to push the company into a zone of immobility. The movement exists, but the direction remains the same, even when the external context has changed. The impact of these small decisions is difficult to measure in the short term. There is no clear indicator that shows the immediate effect of a postponement. There is no graph that shows the psychological cost of avoiding a difficult decision. Therefore, the organization starts to treat these postponements as neutral, when in fact they are cumulative. Each choice to wait a little longer reduces future room for maneuver. Each decision not to act transfers the problem to a time when it will be more expensive, more complex, and more painful to resolve. Over time, the company begins to operate under the logic of accumulation. Unresolved small problems add up. Adjustments that should have been made early become profound reforms. What previously required adaptation now requires disruption, and breaks are always more difficult to execute because they involve fear, resistance, and loss of control. This is the paradox of small decisions. They seem safe at the time they are made, but they create greater risks in the future. Another important aspect is that these choices are almost never discussed openly. They happen in informal conversations, in quick meetings, in decisions that don't seem strategic enough to be documented. This means that no one feels directly responsible for the accumulated effect. Each person participated in a small part, but the final result seems to emerge without authorship. Failure, when it appears collective and diffuse, which makes course correction even more difficult. The psychology behind this behavior is simple and powerful. The human brain tends to underestimate long-term effects and overvalue immediate comfort. Avoiding a difficult decision today reduces discomfort now, even if it increases risk tomorrow. This mechanism works silently, especially in environments where there is no immediate external pressure. Until the numbers collapse, the impulse to act remains weak. As these decisions accumulate, the organization begins to lose agility. Processes become heavier. Adjustments take longer. The reaction to market changes is slow, not because there is a lack of competence, but because the room for error has decreased. The more decisions are postponed, the lower the tolerance for experimentation. The company starts to protect what it has built, even if it means stopping evolving. This scenario creates a specific type of fragility, silent fragility. From the outside, everything looks solid. Inside, the structure is full of small cracks. Each fissure represents a decision not made, a problem not faced, an adaptation not made. None of them are enough to cause immediate collapse, but together they create a system highly vulnerable to any sudden change. The real danger of these small decisions is not in the error itself, but in the feeling of normality they produce. The company continues to operate, so everything seems justifiable. And the longer this pattern continues, the more difficult it becomes to recognize that the problem is not specific, but structural. It's at that point that the organization begins to confuse continuity with progress and routine with real stability. Before we move on to the next aspect of this process, I want to know if this sounds familiar to you. In the comments, write small decision, postponing became standard, or accumulated effect. If you prefer something more direct, comment, this is common, or I've seen it happen. These comments help map out how this type of behavior appears in practice and allow us to move on to the next point with even more clarity. Once the small postponed decisions become part of the normal functioning of the organization, an even more worrying phenomenon emerges. The signs begin to appear, but they are no longer recognized as signs. They don't disappear. On the contrary, they are becoming more and more frequent. The difference is that they are interpreted differently. What would previously attract attention is now treated as noise. What would once cause debate is now quickly rationalized. And so, the company enters a phase in which alerts are present but no longer provoke a reaction. This is a critical time because signs are rarely dramatic. They do not come as a clear threat or a definitive warning. They tend to be subtle, fragmented, and uncomfortable. A gradual increase in customer complaints, a recurring delay in deadlines that were previously easily met, a discrete drop in internal engagement, small inconsistencies in the data. None of this, in isolation, seems enough to justify profound change. But together, these elements form a pattern that begins to repeat itself. The problem is that recognizing this pattern requires a willingness to accept that something fundamental needs to be revised. And this acceptance has a high psychological cost. It means admitting that previous decisions may not have been as wise as previously believed. It means recognizing that control is less than it seemed. Therefore, many leaders choose to reinterpret signals rather than confront them. The brain seeks coherence, and the easiest way to maintain it is to adjust the interpretation of reality, not reality itself. At this stage, data begins to be filtered by internal narratives. Information that confirms expectations is highlighted. Information that contradicts the dominant view is questioned, minimized, or postponed. There is not necessarily bad intention in this process. It happens because the organizational system has become accustomed to avoiding discomfort. Questioning too much begins to be seen as a lack of alignment. Raising problems becomes interpreted as negativity. Little by little, the space for real disagreement shrinks. Over time, people learn to choose which battles are worth fighting. Alerts that would previously have been shared are now saved. Legitimate concerns are silenced before they even reach meetings. This silence is not explicitly imposed. It is learned. It arises from the perception that certain themes do not generate change, only wear and tear. And when this happens, the organization loses one of its most important defenses, the ability to listen to its own internal signals. The effect of this is a kind of collective anesthesia. The company continues to receive information, but reacts to it in an increasingly slow and predictable way. Problems that would require a quick response go into long analysis cycles. Discussions are repeated without generating action. Decisions are postponed on the grounds that there is not yet sufficient evidence. Meanwhile, the external environment continues to transform, without waiting for the organization to reach a comfortable consensus. This process creates an increasing distance between internal perception and external reality. Inside, everything seems under control. From the outside, customers begin to perceive failures more clearly. Partners feel instability. Competitors advance. But as these effects have not yet translated into catastrophic numbers, the sense of urgency has not set in. The company starts to always react one step behind, trying to recover lost ground instead of anticipating movements. Ignoring signs is not a one-time act, it is a habit that is built. Each time an alert is relativized, it becomes easier to relativize the next one. Each time a worry is postponed, the postponement becomes more acceptable. This pattern creates a silent spiral, where the organization progressively moves away from reality without realizing it. When you finally realize it, the margin for correction is much smaller. At this point, many still believe they are being rational, cautious, strategic. Slowness is confused with prudence. Inaction is seen as intelligent waiting. But the cost of this stance is rarely calculated. Lost time does not appear in reports. Trust that erodes is not easily measurable. And so, the company continues to accumulate ignored signals, believing that there is still time to react. Before we go any further, I want to know if you have already did something similar. In the comments, write "signals ignored," "it became noise," or "no one listened." If you prefer something simpler, comment "this is real," or "I've seen it up close." These comments help us understand how this pattern manifests itself in practice and allow us to move on to the next point in even more depth. When signals are already being ignored and silence begins to dominate decisions, the organization enters an even more delicate phase, the phase in which psychological comfort becomes strategy. At this point, it's no longer just about avoiding problems, but about preserving a specific sense of control. Control becomes seen as a central value, even if this means reducing the ability to adapt. The company begins to organize itself not around what is most effective, but what seems safest. This movement is usually accompanied by increasing centralization. Decisions that were previously distributed move up the hierarchy. The justification seems logical: reduce risks, align visions, avoid errors. But the side effect is silent and profound. The more control you concentrate, the slower the organization becomes. Information takes time to circulate. Simple adjustments require multiple approvals, and the time between noticing a problem and acting on it increases steadily. The comfort generated by this excessive control creates a powerful illusion. The feeling that everything is being monitored, reviewed, and validated gives leaders the impression of total control over the situation. But this mastery is superficial. It does not increase the quality of decisions. It only reduces the variety of perspectives involved. The company starts to listen to fewer voices, consider fewer alternatives, and operate within an increasingly narrow field of possibilities. At this stage, perfectionism begins to mix with fear. Projects are postponed because they are not ready yet. Changes are postponed because they don't seem completely safe. The search for perfect decisions replaces the need for timely decisions. And in competitive environments, timing matters as much as quality. The cost of waiting for the optimal decision is rarely calculated accurately, but it adds up quickly. Comfort also affects team behavior. When everything has to go through strict filters, people tend to take fewer risks. Innovative ideas are saved. More daring suggestions are no longer presented. The environment becomes predictable but poor in creativity. The organization starts to value conformity more than adaptation, and this creates a culture where making mistakes is more feared than stagnating. The control trap is reinforced because in the short term, it appears to work. Visible problems diminish. Conflicts are avoided. The feeling of order increases. But this order is fragile. It depends on the constant maintenance of rigid structures that do not keep up with the speed of the external world. The more the company tries to control everything, the less prepared it is to deal with the unexpected, and the unexpected is inevitable. Over time, this dynamic creates an increasing distance between decision and reality. Leaders believe they are in control because everything goes through them, but in practice they are receiving filtered, delayed, and smoothed information. Reality arrives edited. When it finally prevails, the shock is greater. The system that was built to avoid risks proves incapable of reacting when the risk becomes concrete. This is the central paradox of this phase. The comfort that seemed to protect the company begins to weaken it. The control that seemed to guarantee stability starts to generate rigidity. The slowness that seemed like prudence turns into a competitive disadvantage. And even so, abandoning this model becomes difficult because it is deeply linked to the organization's identity. Changing would mean admitting that the control strategy was part of the problem. Before we move forward, it is worth reflecting on whether this pattern has already appeared before you. In the comments, write excessive control, comfort became a trap, or perfectionism delayed. If you prefer something more direct, comment, I've seen that happen, or it makes a lot of sense. These answers help us understand how this trap manifests itself in different contexts and allow us to move on to the next point with more clarity. When the trap of comfort and control is already consolidated, the collapse does not happen as many imagine. There is no specific moment that can be pointed out as the beginning of the fall. There is no day when everything stops, nor an isolated event that explains what happened. What exists is a slow process of wear and tear, almost imperceptible to those inside, but increasingly visible to those observing from the outside. The company does not fall apart. She empties herself. This emptying begins silently. Experienced people start to leave without big announcements. There are no public conflicts, just discreet shutdowns. PR professionals who previously contributed ideas, questions, and energy begin to move away emotionally before even leaving physically. Motivation decreases. The initiative weakens. The work starts to be done automatically, fulfilling minimum expectations without real involvement. The organization continues to operate, but it no longer pulses in the same way. At the same time, the relationship with partners and customers begins to change. Trust is not lost all at once. It wears out little by little. Small delays become frequent. Promises are now partially fulfilled. Communication becomes more defensive. Justifications replace solutions. From the outside, the perception is clear. Something is not working as it used to. From the inside, this perception takes time to form, because the signs do not yet seem serious enough to cause rupture. At this stage, many leaders believe the problem is just operational. All you need to do is adjust processes, reinforce controls, or review goals. Few can see that the collapse is no longer just technical, but structural and psychological. The company lost its ability to adapt quickly. He lost the sensitivity to perceive subtle changes. He lost the habit of questioning his own decisions, and this cannot be resolved with specific adjustments. The most disturbing thing is that the collapse does not generate immediate urgency. It manifests as a sequence of small losses, opportunities that don't materialize, talent that isn't retained, customers that choose alternatives. Every loss seems explainable. Each can be attributed to external factors, and precisely for this reason, none of them is seen as a definitive sign. The organization enters a state of functional denial, where recognizing the severity of the problem would require two profound changes. Meanwhile, the internal narrative remains protected. Meetings are held to align expectations. Plans are created to resume growth. Indicators are analyzed, looking for signs of recovery. There is constant activity, but little real transformation. The company moves, but does not change direction. And the longer you spend in this state, the harder it becomes to recover what was lost. This type of collapse is particularly dangerous because it does not attract attention. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't generate commotion. Many organizations simply fall off the radar. They are acquired under unfavorable conditions, lose relevance, or cease to exist without major repercussions. For those inside, the feeling is one of surprise. For those who observe the process closely, the outcome was predictable for a long time. Invisible collapse is the end result of all previous steps. From the initial silence, the success that changed behaviors, of the small decisions postponed, of ignored signs, from comfort transformed into strategy. When all these elements combine, the end stops being an event and becomes a consequence, not something that happens, but something that reveals itself. At this point, even when reality imposes itself, the ability to react is already compromised. Decisions that could have been made flexibly now require sacrifices. Time that was wasted cannot be recovered, and the organization is forced to deal with a scenario that could have been avoided if the silence had been broken sooner. If you've ever followed a company that seemed solid, but lost momentum without a clear explanation, record it. In the comments, write "silent collapse," "no one noticed," or "it gradually disappeared." If you prefer something simpler, comment "I've seen that happen," or "it makes a lot of sense." These reports help to understand how this type of collapse manifests itself in practice, and take us to the last point of this process. After the silent collapse has set in, and the organization begins to realize that something was lost along the way, a difficult moment to face arises. The moment of human truth. Not a technical truth, not a financial or operational explanation, but the realization that the problem was never just strategy, market, or competition. The problem has always been in behavior, in the way decisions were made, in the way silence has been normalized, in the repetition of choices that seemed safe, but little by little, moved the company away from reality. At this stage, many are still trying to find a specific error to point out. A wrong decision, a project that failed, a leader who left. But this search almost always ends in frustration, because there is no single breaking point. What exists is a pattern. A human, predictable, and profoundly common pattern. A pattern where avoiding discomfort becomes more important than seeking clarity. Where preserving the image of control weighs more than facing real uncertainties. Where silence starts to be treated as a sign of maturity, when in fact it is just the absence of confrontation. The psychological flaw that underpins this entire process is simple, but powerful. The human difficulty of admitting that something needs to change while it still appears to work. There is a natural resistance to interrupting systems that continue to operate, even if they operate poorly. As long as there is movement, it is believed that there is progress. As long as there is no chaos, it is believed that there is no risk. And this belief creates a dangerous delay between noticing and acting. A delay that accumulates until there is no more room for smooth corrections. Another central aspect of this phase is the way in which responsibility is diluted. As decisions were small, gradual, and distributed over time, no one feels directly responsible for the final result. Each choice seemed logical at the time it was made. Each postponement had a plausible justification. And so, failure no longer has a clear face. It becomes systemic. And systemic problems are always more difficult to face because they require profound changes in mentality, not just specific adjustments. This is the point at which many organizations try to reinvent narratives. They talk about repositioning, restructuring, recovery. But without addressing the psychological root of the problem, these attempts tend to repeat the same patterns under new names. The language changes, but the behavior remains. Decisions continue to be postponed. The signals continue to be relativized. Comfort continues to be prioritized. And the cycle is getting ready to start again, even after a significant drop. The truth is that silent decisions are not a rare or exceptional phenomenon. They are part of human nature. We all tend to avoid conflict, postpone difficult choices, and overly rely on what has worked in the past. In organizational settings, this behavior is amplified by structures, hierarchies, and incentives that reinforce apparent stability. The result is a system that protects itself from change until change becomes inevitable. Understanding this process is not just a matter of business analysis. It's a question of conscience, to recognize that silence is not neutral, that the absence of a crisis does not mean health. That normality may just be an interval between avoided decisions and accumulated consequences. Until this understanding takes hold, organizations continue to repeat the same mistakes, believing that this time it will be different, even making exactly the same choices. It is at this point that reflection needs to continue, not as a closure, but as an invitation to observe more closely the patterns that repeat themselves, questioning what is being normalized, understanding where silence is replacing real dialogue. Because until these questions are asked, decisions continue to be made in the same way, silently, gradually, predictably. If this excerpt made you think about real situations, leave it on record. In the comments, write human error, silent decisions, or invisible pattern. If you want something simpler, comment this is repeated or it makes perfect sense. These comments help keep this conversation alive and show how many people have already recognized this pattern before it became impossible to ignore. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this video really hit you. Maybe not as entertainment, but as recognition. This type of content is not made for quick consumption. It is made for those who observe, reflect, and notice patterns that most ignore. If this video made sense to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Not to receive empty notifications, but to continue monitoring analyses that go beyond the surface of the business and into the human behavior behind decisions. If something here reminded you of a company, a leader, or a real situation you've experienced, leave it in the comments. You can write, "This happens more than it seems," "Silence deceived," or simply, "I've seen this up close." These comments show that this conversation is not theoretical. It is real, lived, and recurring. And if you made it to the end, leave a like. Not in support of the video, but as a sign that this type of analysis still has space. Because as long as there are silent decisions being made, stories like this will continue to repeat themselves.